Welcome to this CPD session. Our topic today is the SA economy in a globalized world. Right, our contents, what we're going to discuss today are three things. First of all, I would guess that for real estate practitioners, interest rates and the impact on house prices is quite important. So I'm going to deal with this. And then secondly, what makes a society prosper? I think that's important because as South Africans, we are at the crossroads, and it's important for us as individuals and as organizations to have a feel for what's in store for us. And then thirdly, the prospects for the SA economy against the background of what makes society prosper. So that, in a nutshell, then is what we're going to talk about. Right, first of all, interest rates and house prices. Interest rate is nothing but the price or the rent to use somebody else's money. I think we all know that. Money could therefore be seen as an object that is scarce, like seashells or gold. In fact, in history, there was a society that used seashells as a form of money. The important thing here is it must be scarce, otherwise people would just falsify it. Thirdly, money could be a piece of paper, in other words, an IOU, that is backed by a credible authority. That is the latest developments, of course. Well, not the very latest, but that was the interim solution to a scarcity of metal. And then, importantly, South Africa moved away from backing, from using gold as a backing to our paper money in 1932. Those of you who know your history, that was a terrible year for South Africa. South Africa refused to follow the United Kingdom in departing from the gold standard, and the economy went through a dive as a result, and soon thereafter we were forced to follow the United Kingdom in stepping off the gold standard. And from then, of course, onwards, what it meant is that the central bank, the Reserve Bank, now had a great responsibility not to inflate our money supply unreasonably. And this is, of course, exactly what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. Our government was under huge pressure, as you know, and, of course, when you are under pressure, like in a war situation, there's always the likelihood that you're going to start printing money. In other words, create inflation as a result of that. However, the good news is that since 1988, the Reserve Bank changed tack, and they increased interest rates something terribly, and in the process, they brought we could bring interest rates down, and as a result of that, property prices, more specifically house prices, started booming. All right, so that's the very short introduction to the history of money in South Africa. Now, let's break up the history of South Africa from 1966 to 1987. I use that as a first period because 88 is when we started getting inflation under control. And 1966 is a start year because that's the furthest back we have house prices in South Africa. Now, we've done the exercise and we found that a 10% rise in interest rates resulted in an 18% rise in house prices, and vice versa during this period. Now, you may say, but it's impossible. We all know that when interest rates rise, house prices come down. Not so. Well, during this period, it didn't happen. In fact, a rise in interest rates caused, at least that's what it looks like, a rise in house prices. Actually, it wasn't that simple. The anomaly can be explained by monetary policy. We had very lax monetary policy at the time, and this resulted in demand pull inflation as a result of the overheating of the economy, which resulted in the following scenario. Yes, the authorities saw that they had to increase interest rates because of inflation, but they didn't increase enough because the economy was booming, and therefore the booming economy was sort of more than neutralizing the effect on affordability of rising interest rates. And that's why you have this paradox during this period that at times the house prices actually moved higher when interest rates were also rising at the same time. And this, of course, would explain to me at least why to this day in South Africa, so many South Africans reckon that there's nothing as good as bricks and mortar as an investment. They reckon it's infallible. Well, we shall see. Right, now, at a later period from 1988 to 2017, here we had a completely opposite reaction and a more reasonable outcome, the sort of outcome you would expect reasonably. During this period, from 1988, a 10% rise in interest rates resulted in a 25% decline in house prices and vice versa. Now you can see this is a huge change that results from a 10% rise in interest rates. By the way, I just make sure that you guys understand what a 10% rise in interest rates is. It's not to be confused with a 10 percentage point rise in interest rates. A 10% rise in interest rates, let me give an example. Let's say interest rate is now 10% and it rises by 10%, then the 10% becomes 11%, right? 11 divided by 10 multiplied by 100 gives you 10% rise. Right. So this is the period that is sort of where the relationship between interest rates and house prices normalized. And here you can see quite clearly what happened with house prices from 1988 onwards. That is the latest era that we're covering, where the relationship was more or less normal. And you will see that the house prices are the blue line. And we had this peak in 2004, but still growing very fast by 2008 when the international financial crisis hit us. And when house prices, as a result, peaked and dived, in fact, to below zero. You'll find it interesting that there's a period in the beginning, about 1992, you'll see, during that period, prime rate, interest rates were coming down, but house prices were also coming down, even steeper. And the question is why? Because normally you would expect an inverse relationship between house prices and interest rates. The explanation is political. If you may recall, that was a period, Boipatong, when we had when the negotiations with the ANC came to a halt, and when we had this slaughter at Boipatong. So what happened then, of course, was that confidence in the country dropped through the floor, and that resulted in house prices tumbling even more. And that brings us to confidence. We mustn't underestimate the importance of confidence in growing the economy, and we saw that very recently when, towards the end of the Zuma era, what happened to the economy because confidence left the borders of South Africa. Right, now a very interesting question I'm putting to you. Why are some countries poor and why are some rich? Well, I've done some research, very interesting research, mainly by the author Eric Beinhocker. In spite of his surname, I suspect he's either British or American. He did some very interesting research. I've been reading and rereading this book for a long time now. And his conclusions are as follows. There are cultural norms that determine wealth. Now, up to a very short while ago, in America at least, I'm sure in South Africa too, you were not supposed to use the word culture. It was toxic. Nowadays, it becomes okay again to talk about culture. It's not racist anymore. Right, so here we are. What are the cultural norms that determine wealth? Number one, individual behavior. And that includes work ethic, individual accountability, belief you are the master of your own destiny, rather than gods or big men. Right? Now you can cross your mind and think of countries where that is the case or not the case. Secondly, rules regarding payoffs to cooperative behavior. In other words, does it pay you to cooperate with other people? If a society sees the world as a zero-sum game, it hinders cooperation. Also, at the same time, if you don't trust your fellow man, then all other things being equal, that nation will not be very good at becoming wealthy. Now, while we are on this, trust seems to be exceedingly important. Who could have thought that by trusting your fellow man, up to a certain point, of course, that it could lead, inter alia, to higher growth in the economy? And here I've got a graphic for you. This research was done in 1996, and on the horizontal axis, you've got GNP per capita, and on the vertical axis, you've got percentage who trust people in general. Please note people in general. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't sign contracts if you have a high trust in people. It just means you're more capable and wanting to cooperate to build big organizations and very complex organizations. Now, let's first look at those nations with a very high percentage of trust in people. And you'll see the top right-hand corner is Norway, the most trusting country in the world. We know their GDP is also very, very high, as you can see on the horizontal scale. And you'll also notice that that cluster of countries like Netherlands and Sweden and Denmark, they tend to be Protestant countries. Further down, you tend to have historically Catholic countries and Islamic countries. Islamic countries seem to be the worst because they're on the very low on the left-hand corner at the bottom, right? South Africa, where does South Africa fit in this? This is the sad news. We are near the left-hand corner, about 20%, and our neighbors are Nigeria, I can't see the other name from where I'm standing here, but certainly we are in the neighborhood of Nigeria. In other words, the trustworthiness, our trusting of our fellow South Africans is pretty low compared to the Norwegians, where it's about 65% or so. Right, so that is in itself not good news for us. One wonders what causes distrust in the fellow man. Right, let's go back. We've now done cooperative behavior. Now, the third factor that determines wealth is norms related to innovation. Deductive tinkering is very important. Now, what is deductive tinkering? It is as opposed to inductive thinking. Inductive, it's in our brains through evolution. Mankind is very strong at inductive thinking, which means we can take quick and fast decisions when we hear a sound that sounds like the roar of a saber-toothed tiger. Right? We can take quick action because our brain's been wired to this degree that we know intuitively through induction that this is danger and we should react. And that, by the way, also explains to a great degree why people are maybe racist or all the other bad things we may know about people. In fact, research shows that by the age of about 4, your norms are already imprinted on your brain, and it's very difficult thereafter to change your ideas, even though your brain tells you it is wrong. Right. The other thing, of course, apart from deductive tinkering, is rational scientific explanations of the world rather than religious or magical explanations. And that's quite important. I sometimes get the impression that the Western world today, with maybe the exception of America, the United States, that they don't take religion all that seriously anymore. Right, and then the last one is tolerant of heresy and experimentation. You remember the Middle Ages when people were burnt at the stake for being heretics? That was also the period when mankind didn't improve by very much. Right, and then the fourth and very important determinant is how people view time. Now, this got nothing to do with African time. Cultures that live for today lack a work ethic and inability to engage in complex cooperation and have low levels of investment in innovation. In other words, people who think for today and don't think about tomorrow, those are the people who don't save either, and in other words, they don't think for the long term. So that's quite important as another factor. Now, all these factors, all 4 of them, you can apply them to your own organization and also to your own personal behavior and see what are the prospects for you to become wealthy. Right. Now, there's another way of looking at the drivers of wealth, and that is by looking at state and economic institutions. This is done by another author. In fact, it's two authors. And by the way, please read the précis that I wrote about this topic for this CPD. It's quite fascinating to get more information, detailed information on what I'm skimming at the moment. Right, there are two types of institutions in the world, extractive and inclusive. Extractive institutions are where the state power is narrow and unconstrained. You think in the Middle Ages of, say, monarchs, right, who wielded complete power, absolute power, compared to inclusive situations like a typical modern democratic society, which is pluralistic, as it distributes power broadly in society. And yes, South Africa did in this respect the right thing in 1994. So that is a tick box for South Africa in this respect. The important point is that rich nations have developed inclusive institutions at some point during the past 300 years. In fact, while we are on this topic, it might interest you that throughout the history of mankind, wealth increased very, very little, if at all, per capita. And it's only since about 1750, when the Industrial Revolution started in the United Kingdom, it's only thereabouts that all of a sudden wealth started growing at an exponential rate. It's amazing how it grew from that period onwards in the world. And this process is still ongoing. And as some people are saying, we're now at the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, now let's apply this to South Africa. Let's see where South Africa stands. The longer-term prospects for the South African economy are bleak, I'm afraid to say. First of all, we've got a brain drain. I don't know in which circles you guys move, but in the circles I move, about 50% of the children have immigrated. And parents, grandparents fly all over the world to see their grandchildren, and then they have to speak English to them. We know our educational system is dysfunctional. There's no disagreement on that. The question then is why? Now, the popular explanation is that it's still about Bantu education in the apartheid era. But the fascinating thing is that I did some research on this. The curricula during the apartheid era for Bantu education was the same as the curricula of the white provincial curricula in South Africa, right? So it's not the curriculum that can be blamed. In fact, when you look at all the factors together, it seems that the quality of our teachers must be the main reason. And if that is true, it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to take a generation or two to improve the quality of our teachers. And that must be, for any government, it should be priority number one. Because unless we improve the quality of our teachers in the long term, we don't have a future. Right. Thirdly, I'm sorry to say, but until now, the government has been playing a zero-sum game. The idea seems to be that one must re-slice the pie rather than grow the pie. Now, you can disagree with me, but that's in any event my impression. We all know that corruption has become endemic, and the question is to what degree can the new president root that out? I'm a bit skeptic. I mean, you'll do it at the top. That would be the easy one, I think. But it's much more than just the top people in the country. And then, of course, the most scary thing of everything is that given our poor education system, the coming great technology disruption that is coming our way, the world over, not just in South Africa, of course, where skilled and semi-skilled people's jobs are going to be on the line. It's going to be, their jobs are going to be displaced by computers and robots and artificial intelligence and things like that. As a result of all these things, the IMF has scaled down South Africa's expected long-term growth rate to about 2%, as compared to the 3 to 3.5% growth rate that we had from 1945 to 2010, say. And the last thing, of course, is that, and this is the thing that goes back many, many decades, South Africa's savings rate is dismal, which means that we are utterly and completely dependent on external money, capital flowing into our country to invest in our country, because we are not saving the money ourselves, which makes us completely dependent on the outside world. Now, that is a double-edged sword. It also has a positive to it, and I'll come to that in a moment. Which brings us to the shorter-term prospects. The fiscus, as we know, has run out of space, and we've just seen yesterday the new budget, and that reflects this conundrum. We all know that our SOEs are dysfunctional, our state-owned enterprises, and quite frankly, some of them will be very, very difficult to resurrect. Commodity prices are not coming to our rescue, although there are the first signs that maybe commodity prices are slightly growing, but it's very tentative and it's not enough to make me optimistic. Fourthly, the interest rates in the world will have to be raised sometime in the future. It's a question of time, because we all know interest rates in the world are too low, and you can't build a world economy on interest rates that are that low. And of course, lastly, consumers in South Africa are still over-indebted. And remember that about 65% of GDP, gross domestic product, is comprised of consumer spending in South Africa, as it is in many other Western countries. So with the exception of Germany and Japan and people like that who are compulsive savers. And you can see that in the results of the economies too, how good saving is. Saving for the future. It's a time question, not so, as we discussed before. Right, so what it means is that looking at the shorter term, because consumers are now going to be under quite a bit of stress because of this budget, which was inevitable, don't expect too much of a growth in the coming 2 years or so. We will have some growth, and the forecasts are optimistic that the growth will accelerate slightly, but not too much. Right. As a result of that, for the next 5 years or so, the approximate growth rate is forecast to be about 2% on average per year. As a result of all what you've now heard, my prognosis for South Africa is as follows. First of all, it's a mixed bag of pros and cons. Especially positive is the Constitution and the free media. This is South Africa's gold standard, if you like. This is what gives us a future. Thirdly, don't expect the growth in the economy will improve on the 1945 to 2008 rate of 3 to 3.5%. Ah, there it is, 2008, not 2010. In fact, it will be lower and closer to 2% per annum. And that's got huge implications for employment creation, of course. As we know, unemployment will inevitably have to rise in the long run because of the prognosis for the economy. And this is, believe me, irrespective of who governs this country. Unemployment is a huge fundamental problem to our economy. And it is the outcome of poor education, and that will only be rectified in a few generations' time. And because of all these reasons, no matter how good the president is going to turn out to be, there's a great danger of populism taking over after Cyril Ramaphosa. Right. While I'm saying thank you, I would also like to bring to your attention, please remember to answer the 10 multiple choice questions to obtain your 5 verifiable CBD points for this session.